15. Man or sheep. Thomas Hobbes, we encountered him when thinking about self-interest, wrote that man's life was solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short. The obvious reply is, it could have been worse. Thomas, it could have been solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and long. Hobbes was describing life before the existence of a state, government and law. Humans are competitive. They lack reason to trust each other, unless there is a powerful authority that sets laws and punishes lawbreakers. In a state of nature, individuals would be in constant conflict or, at least, always on their guard, insecure, and ready for battle. The state of nature, of life pre-government, is a state of war. With the state of nature so horrible, human beings would obviously want to escape into something better. According to Hobbes, they would come together and agree on a sovereign, an absolute authority, to represent and rule over them, giving them security and opportunity to lead reasonable lives. There are many Hobbesian puzzles, not least why individuals in the state of nature would risk trusting each other to keep any agreement. Let us, though, not worry about how government arises. Here we are, living within a state. Let us assume we have a government democratically elected. Whatever the degree of democracy, laws are imposed that restrict what we may do. We may disapprove of some laws because of certain moral or religious principles. We may disapprove of other laws simply because they prevent us from getting what we want. The general concern becomes, by what authority does any government rightfully rule over us? Why should we obey the state and its laws? We may answer in practical terms. We obey the law because we are scared of the consequences of disobedience, not wanting to risk fines and imprisonment. The rational thing to do, given the aim of getting on with our lives as best we can, is to obey. When asked whether man or mouse, some of us tend to squeak and take the cheese. Even more so may most of us squeak, when the tentacles of the law and the long arm of the police take hold. We mice may, indeed, be more akin to sheep, sheepishly following each other in our general obedience. Our puzzle though is what, if anything, makes obeying the law the right thing to do, even if we could get away with disobeying. Many of us benefit because of the state's existence. We are defended from others, receive state education, health services, in return for paying taxes. We are better off with law than without. So, we are obligated, in return, to obey the laws that confer those benefits. One immediate objection is that this justification for lawful obedience fails to work for those who overall do not benefit. A significant number do very badly, sleeping rough, being denied state benefits, and being avoided by those better off. Why should they obey? Also, some at society's top may argue that they contribute more than they receive, probably forgetting that they secured them more because of society's stability and protection of gross inequalities, often inherited. Even when overall we do benefit from the state's existence, it does not follow that we are under any obligation to the benefactor. Did we ever sign up, agreeing that we would accept benefits in return for obeying the law? If someone buys us a drink, without under an obligation to buy one in return. Reference to signing up casts us along another line, a line orientated towards the social contract. What justifies the state and our obedience is that we consented to the setup. Some philosophers, John Locke, for example, probably the most influential political philosopher from the 17th century, individuals made contracts to be governed by believed that historically some an authority acting in their interests, leading to our societies. Of course, there is no reason to believe in such historical events, but, even if they occurred, what relevance do they have for us today? We were not around hundreds of years ago, engaging in any contractual deals. The response to that last thought is to spot features of our current lives that may indicate consent. We make use of the state's services. In Britain, we on the King's Highway. Notes lock travel freely. Well, today the Queen's Highway. This shows that we tacitly consent to the state, or does it? Just because we remain in this country, using its facilities, it does not follow that we consent. After all, what other options are available? Can most people afford to go elsewhere? Would other countries, with acceptable laws, permit entry? It is, notes David Hume, key 18th century philosopher and historian, as if we find ourselves on a ship in the middle of the ocean, with the captain making the point that, if we disapprove of his orders, we are free to leave. Rationality is often wheeled out, to come to the rescue. True, we were not involved in any original social contract. True, our remaining within our society fails to establish consent. But suppose we were rational, not yet in a society, and needing to create society's basic principles. Suppose, too, we were ignorant of our sex, race, abilities and the position we probably would reach in society, be it through chance or talent. In such an original position, behind a veil of ignorance, where everything is fair between us, our thinking, even though we remain as individuals, would not be distorted by a distinctive self-interest differing from the self-interest of others. Rather, our common rationality and interests should lead us to see and accept what would constitute fair laws, benefits and rights for all. Behind the veil of ignorance, it would seem rational to consent to a society that permitted basic freedoms, did not discriminate between individuals on irrelevant grounds, and provided welfare benefits for when things go badly. After all, behind the veil of ignorance, we have no idea whether we may end up belonging to minority groups or hitting hard times. If our current society possesses the features it would be rational to consent to behind the veil, then our obedience today is justified by this hypothetical consent, by what is seen as a hypothetical contract. The response, by way of jibe, is that hypothetical contracts are not worth the paper they are not written upon. Hypothetical consent is not consent. The jibe, though, misses the point. Justifications can rightly involve hypotheticals. Why did you battle with the man, yanking him from the cliff's path, despite his protests? Because, had he been sober, he would have consented to the yanking, to save him from risking a fatal fall. The resort to the veil of ignorance, to rationality and to consent, even if hypothetical, raises its own puzzles. Quite what does rationality involve behind such a veil? Is it rational, for example, to place liberty higher than greater welfare benefits requiring higher levels of taxation? Further, once in society, if now convinced that eternal life demands obedience to God, it would be rational to oppose liberal laws that were once appealing, when ignorant and behind the veil. Whatever justifications are offered for general obedience to the state, sometimes we morally ought to disobey. Had only many consulted their humanity instead of the law, various atrocities, instituted by governments, could have been avoided. Had only many opened themselves to fellow feeling rather than going along with the mice and the sheep. Mind you, that is so easy for me to say and you to read as, in all likelihood, we sit reasonably well off, looking at this book, not having to stand up and be counted, and also not scraping a living in desperate circumstances, on the point of starvation. Recall Chapter 8 and Mr. Miller's fortunate circumstances compared to Herr Muller's. Many of us are fortunate, through good fortune. We form a cocoon from millions are dispossessed in the world for whom life is certainly, to return to Hobbes, nasty, brutish and short. 16. I shot the sheriff. Sheriff has been seriously wounded while trying to stop bandits' raid on a remote ranch. He clings on to his faithful horse, which gallops him back to Little Rock, as faithful horses do. Bandit returns to the bandit family in its mountain hideaway. Bandit boasts, I shot the sheriff, shows off his ill-gotten gains and initiates sustained celebrations. Back in Little Rock, beloved Sheriff is tended by the Little Rock dock, while a lynch mob sets off in search of Bandit. Sheriff, man of the law, makes clear his opposition to any lynching. I'm only shot, not killed. Bring Bandit back alive, but he rightly fears the worse, both for Bandit and for respect towards the law. Celebrations in the hideaway are so noisy and drunken that mob, after a few days riding, has little difficulty in finding the required Bandit. Bandit is lynched. Mob returns to Little Rock, where the Little Rock Doc still struggles to keep Sheriff alive. Doc does his best, but his best is not good enough, no doubt aided by Doc's propensity for gin. A few weeks later, Sheriff dies from his wounds, still displeased by the lynching. It is worth noting that we already have a puzzle. Given his gin-soaked ineptness, should the doctor be held directly responsible for Sheriff's death rather than Bandit? Let us place that matter to one side by making Doc a highly competent teetotal doctor. Bandit undoubtedly killed Sheriff. He died of the wounds from Bandit's gunshots. When Bandit killed him may be thought to be baffling. Did he kill him when he shot him? That is highly implausible. Sheriff remained alive for weeks after the shooting, and so there is no way he could have been killed by the shooting, at the time of the shooting, while yet going on living afterwards. Did Bandit kill him at the point when he died? That too seems implausible, for when Sheriff died, Bandit had been dead for a few weeks, lynched by mob. How could a dead man, in these circumstances, kill? It is not as if Bandit's corpse swung round in the noose and gave Sheriff a fatal blow. Where the killing took place may also be thought baffling. The shooting occurred at the ranch, but Sheriff was never dead at the ranch. He died in Little Rock, yet Bandit never went into Little Rock. When Sheriff eventually died there, Bandit was but a corpse in a remote mountain range. When and where does a killing take place? This is no mere academic question. The law needs to decide about such matters. Assuming Bandit acted intentionally, and that various other conditions were met, Sheriff's killing is a murder, but where and when did the murder take place? The location may be highly relevant because where a law is broken usually determines the punishment. In some places murderers receive short so-called life sentences, maybe 10 years, yet elsewhere they meet with the death penalty, an extremely shortened life sentence. The time a crime occurred can also be highly relevant, for which punishment is meted out hangs on the law at the time of the offense and the age of the offender. The right way of looking at this may be simply to remember that the law needs to decide about such matters. For practical reasons, we do just need to make decisions. It would be a mistake to think that, by investigating the world, we can rightly conclude that the murder occurred at precisely this point or that point. Perhaps the underlying mistake is to think that there must be precision when there is none. The facts may be, for example, that a murder occurred in Virginia and in 1892, but Virginia, and indeed 1892, are pretty big. No doubt we can be more precise about the murder, but we should not assume that, in principle, we are always able to pinpoint a murder's time and location to a very high degree of specificity. A murder need not be space-time specific or have a precise location, akin to that of when and where a small alarm first went off. Returning to Sheriff and Bandit, the correct description is as given in the tale. There was a shooting. It was fatal because some weeks later, in a different place, Sheriff died from his wounds. Legislators need to make decisions as to which laws should apply and, for the sake of justice, they need to ensure consistency. That is all that can be said. Or perhaps we can say more. There are many areas in life where the need to make decisions about which rules, regulations or laws should apply has not yet arisen. Imagine a football game in which a player kicks the ball a moment before being shot dead. A few seconds later, the ball ends up in the net. A dead player scored. Do the rules permit that? Not being a footballer, I do not know, but there is no difficulty in football games occurring without specific rules to cover that unusual eventuality. Or imagine a chess player makes a move, has a heart attack and immediately dies. His opponent studies the board, slowly realizes his position is impossible and resigns. The deceased player won, after his demise. Is that allowed? We should not be surprised that what is true of people can start to apply after their death. Someone who has deliberately taken a poison, one which works slowly, only becomes a successful suicide when dead, not when she took the poison, but there is no clear answer, in such a case, as to when she committed suicide. Bandit became the murderer of sheriff after his bandit's death, but that should no more strike us as curious than the fact that a woman in New York can become a widow because something happens in Shanghai, the death of her husband, and can become a grandmother because her daughter gives birth thousands of miles away in London. To think that, for there to be such truths, there must be changes in the New York woman over and above the changes in Shanghai and London is a mistake that, arguably, was made by Leibniz, Gottfried Wilhelm Leibniz, a German thinker of the 17th century. Leibniz's own life illustrates the point that changes in what is true about someone do not necessitate changes in that someone. Leibniz sought fame and fortune, but died disenchanted. Only his secretary attended his funeral. He was buried in an unmarked grave. Subsequent researches into his vast quantity of writings, still not fully investigated, have led to significant reassessments. He is now a great and famous philosopher and mathematician, intellectually admired, yet nothing, of course, has changed in him, despite these new truths about him, resulting from the causal transmissions of his work over the centuries. Usually what we do involves causal chains, and our focus is normally on quite what it is that we do, rather than the effects centuries later. Here is an illustration. Samantha poured the petrol and threw a lighted match, which ignited the petrol and set fire to the curtains, which caused the wood paneling to catch light, which caused the roof to collapse, which caused the fire to spread, which caused people to scream, and so on. Small wonder that whether Samantha burnt the house down depends on what happened some time after the initial pouring and match throwing, but her doing does not extend to years. Developments in the preservation of frozen human sperm, eggs and embryos may well raise more questions, in this area, about when and where fathering and mothering take place. Oscar's sperm and Olivia's eggs were taken in 2007. Fertilization occurred in 2011, the embryo was implanted in a womb in 2014 and the child was born in 2015. When did Oscar father, and Olivia mother, the child? Maybe they both died just before the sperm and eggs were collected, maybe they died in 2008 or 2012 and at different times. Some men have said, with a twinkle in their eyes, that they are not knowingly fathers. Give it time and both men and women may sometimes be able to say that, and be able, metaphorically, to say it even from the grave. The grave may be a fine and silent place, but even there, where we are well and truly deceased may yet become parents, and perhaps long time deceased, we may yet become parents.